All right, Ron.
Oh, hey Mario.
This is our first interview. You're on the couch, and I'm so thankful you're here. And I just want to start from the beginning. If you could tell me about your childhood.
Wow. Well, there's a lot of years that go into that childhood because there's a part of me, as you've perhaps heard me say, that I appreciate my childhood and my childlike characteristics that, in some respects, I never want to get rid of. I believe that being childlike is something that no matter how old one is, it's important to maintain. The openness, the adventurousness, the resilience, all of the characteristics that you see in children. There's a difference, of course, between childish versus having your inner child still be obvious in your personality. But I'll be more specific in my answer, so you can edit that part out.
No, so where did you grow up, Ron?
Well, I was born in Chicago, Illinois. My parents were American citizens born in Seattle, Washington. And they were living in Seattle when World War II broke out. So they were interned in a camp called Tule Lake. Which was one of 9 relocation camps that were created under Executive Order 9066 by Roosevelt after the Japanese. Yeah, my parents were born in Seattle, Washington, and so they were American citizens. But as everyone knows, on December 7th, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. And as a result, there were 120,000 people that were incarcerated in 9 relocation camps scattered around the United States. My parents were interned in a camp called Tule Lake, which was in Northern California, 5 miles from the Oregon border. They were incarcerated there until early 1943. When they were released, they were given $50 and a bus ticket to Chicago. And my parents were spent the rest of the war years there, although my father ended up joining the military, and he was in MIS, Military Intelligence Service, during the war. My mother, I've often told the story, looking for an apartment, pregnant with me, knocked on a door of this apartment for rent, and the woman came out and looked at my mother, and my mother asked her if she had an apartment for rent. And the woman asked her, "Are you a Jap?" Of course, it's hard for a person to lie about it. So she said, "Yes, I am." And the woman started to close the door on her and said, "We don't rent to Japs." So my mother stuck her foot in the door and she asked, "Are you a Christian?" And the woman said, "Yes, I am." Well, my mother had seen her crucifix on the wall behind her. The woman said, "Yes, I am." And my mother said, "Well, I am too. So if you'll give us a chance and let us move in and you don't like us, we'll move out." So in a couple of months, my mother and she were having tea together. My mother had won her over by being granted the opportunity. So that was the start. I was born then probably 6 or 7 months later in October of 1943. So my childhood was in 2 places. One is in Chicago. subsequently, they moved to New York, where my sister, Barb, was born 4 years later. So my early childhood was between Chicago to New York, where my parents lived until I was in third grade, and my parents got a divorce. So my mother became a single parent with two kids, a boy, me, that was probably 8 years old, and my sister 4 when we moved back to Chicago. So my early childhood, I remember going to PS 152 in New York, moving to Chicago, and going to a school, race school on the south side of Chicago, where we were a minority, obviously, but it was largely African Americans. There were a few white people and Asian people. Subsequent to that, my mother met a man who had never been married, a Japanese man by the name of Shuji Kimura. Shuji lived out in a town called Crystal Lake, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, about 45 miles northwest of Chicago. And so he and my mother hit it off, and they ended up getting married. Subsequently, we moved out to Crystal Lake, Illinois, which was a town of about 15,000 people. And Shuji was a photographic research chemist with Morton Salt. And he was such an amazing individual. He was living with his father and his mother when he and my mother met and married. So my mother, my sister Barb, and I moved into a house that was populated by Shuji's father. His mother had subsequently passed away. So we had a very unusual upbringing in Crystal Lake, Illinois. I was the first Japanese person to attend the grade school and then subsequently the high school. So it was a very interesting opportunity, shall we say, for me to meld into a all white neighborhood where we were the only Japanese family in town and so forth. I would often forget that I was Japanese until at the end of the school day, I'd come home and I'd be combing my hair or something, and I'd look in the mirror and I'd say, wow, you don't look like the other kids that you see in the junior high and then later in high school. So I learned early on, Mario, that as my mother had told me, Ron, you are who your friends are. So the friends I had in junior high and high school were primarily 3 individuals. Dave Kruger, Rick Law, and there was one other person whose name I forget, but one was very athletic, one was very scholarly, and the other one was very popular. So the 4 of us would all band together, but I learned early on that you are who your friends are. So that was my primary lesson that I grew up with in childhood.
And what were you like as a teenager, and what were you into, and what were your interests back then, or your dreams? Did you have dreams back then?
Yeah, there's a couple things that come to mind in hearing that question. One is, I remember having a difficult time adapting to being under the authority of this guy, Shuji Kimura. who established rules. For example, we would have a limited amount of hours being able to watch TV. I can only imagine what that would be like now with cell phones and so forth. We also had to do our share of the chores, washing dishes and helping around the house, mowing the lawn. We had 6 acres of property, so there was a lot of work to do. We would have to clean out the chicken house. We'd haul horse manure in trailers and scatter the horse manure among the strawberry fields and the orchards that we had on our 6 acres. So I was really rebellious. I went through a really tough time because I went from being head of household with my mother being single. She put me in a position of authority over my sister Barb. And then when I had to deal with rules and being demoted, I rebelled. And I went through a real difficult time and got involved in stuff that I feel a certain amount of shame about. I engaged in shoplifting. There are some things that I talk about now which I can't even believe that I did. For example, I shoplifted a parakeet one time. I went into the Woolworth store and picked out a parakeet, put them in a box, and then just walked out. And there were other criminal activities that say to me now in retrospect that I was really just rebelling against authority, rules of the house. But I have to say that in retrospect, this man, Shuji Kimura, was such a wonderful role model of a man in my life that helped put me on the path of who I am today. And without him, I don't know that I would have grown in the way that I have. So thanks be to Shuji Kimura and his influence.
Wow. And you took his name?
I took his name. Barb and I both took his name, although he never legally adopted us. It was one of those situations that my Social Security card, when I first got Social Security, and at 16, my driver's license, it's always been Kimura.
And was your dad in your life?
My dad, to a certain degree, was in my life. My mother, when I was 14 years old, we used to spend summers where he was living. He had subsequently remarried the woman that he was involved with that caused my parents' divorce. And they lived in Paramus, New Jersey. So summers, Barb and I would go visit him and stay with him. Eventually, my mother stopped allowing us to go to Paramus, New Jersey, because he had stopped paying child support. And his rationale for this stopping payment was allegedly to put the child support in a college trust fund. Well, I didn't utilize any trust fund, but my sister had student loans that she needed to pay off upon her graduation. So at one point in time, I went to him at, I was probably around 23 years old, and I confronted him and I said, I understand that you stopped paying child support to put money into a college trust fund for us. I didn't need it, but my sister Barb does. And at that time he confessed that there was no such college trust fund. So that told me a lot about Morris. Abe was his name, as the kind of person he was. And subsequently, we developed a relationship that I would see him from time to time. But he was the kind of person that, as I look back on and make a comparison to Shuji Kimura and Morris Abe, how would I have grown up under his tutelage? And the choice for me was fairly obvious, that Shuji Kimura was the person that really enabled me to become the person that I've become.
And other than putting rules that you couldn't watch cartoons, what were some of the things that Shuji instilled in you?
Well, patience. That's an area that I'm still working on over the years. I've always attempted to, some would call it, be efficient. For example, one of my jobs in mowing the lawn was also to rake up the leaves. Well, the standard protocol for raking up leaves is to create raking up leaves into a pile of maybe 4 square feet, hauling them over to one central area, and then burning those leaves. That was the standard protocol. I came up with the idea of laying out a huge swath of visqueen and raking the leaves all onto the visqueen, and then dragging that huge swath of visqueen all into the pile of leaves, doing it all at the same time, instead of taking 1 wheelbarrow, 2 wheelbarrows, 3 wheelbarrows at the same time. So after I left to go to college, I found that Shuji, who had to take over the job that I had of raking up leaves, was utilizing my invention. But that all came from being trying to find the most efficient way of doing a job that was done in one way. I created a different way of doing it, but that's because of my impatience, I would maintain. So, but there were other things that he required of us to carry our own weight, and I believe that these are all things that later on in life, when you realize that life is not a bowl of cherries, and sometimes you have to experience discomfort and be uncomfortable. And these are things that, whether it's cleaning out a chicken house or a chicken coop or hauling manure or anything, those are not things that the average teenager enjoyed doing, but that's all part of carrying your own weight, carrying your own responsibility. So that's a couple of examples.
And your mom, in that early story where she is like Mother Mary almost, looking for a place to live, how was Jesus and religion brought into your childhood? Was that part of, did she instill that in you guys when you were young? Yeah,
well, my mother became a Christian when she was in the camp. It's really an amazing story that there were, suffering is something that she and all of the other internees had to endure. And she demonstrated to me that to be worthy of your suffering requires a different kind of attitude. The victim mentality that people that have undergone adversity and unfairness in life is really exemplified by Jesus's service and Jesus's suffering, bearing the cross, as it were. And my mother's exposure to Christianity came from the camp. However, I don't believe that Morris, her husband, was necessarily a believer or was interested in that sort of organized religion. It was only until later on when my mother Marge and Shuji married that faith became an integral part of our life. We belonged to the First Congregational Church of Crystal Lake. I was confirmed when I was 13 years old, and that's when my acting career started. I played King Herod in the Christmas pageant. So I was King Herod, and my line, which I still remember all of those years later, was, "Ho, ho, ho, little do they know what plans I have in store for the child." So, but again,
That was your only line in the whole play?
that was my only line in the whole play. But can you imagine, in retrospect, seeing this Japanese kid playing King Herod in a town of all white people? Just thinking about it makes me laugh. But to your point, faith-wise, my parents taught Sunday school and so forth. So it was, in retrospect, it was not that big of a deal. It was just part of how they lived life.
And was he already a Christian as well? Is that?
Shuji was already a Christian, and so he and my mother were on the same page in that regard. I have to say, however, that in my own life, even though I was confirmed and went to Sunday school and all of that, that my own faith really didn't evolve until later on in my life.
I'm going to ask you more on that. As a child, were there other mentors that you remember that had an impact in your life, teenage years, leading into college, or even in college?
Well, it's interesting. The question that I ask myself and others is life providential and predestined? That's kind of the rhetorical question. And I have to say that in retrospect, that there have been so many instances where God's been a part of my life that I had no idea of where I was headed, what I was doing, any of these things. So from the faith standpoint, it became apparent probably, I would say, after I left home and was out of college. It was probably when I was in my 40s that the predestination and the providential aspect of life and faith came to be more apparent to me.
You've told me the story of the birth of your first son. Can you talk about that and how that was such a life-changing moment in your life?
Sure. When I was 19 years old and had decided early on, actually in high school, that I wanted to go to college in a couple of places. I investigated small school in Illinois, a college in Oregon, and the University of Hawaii. And I ultimately settled on the University of Hawaii after reading a book called Hawaii, where I was curious about culture and race and so forth. So I I landed in Hawaii with $180 in my pocket, didn't know anybody, and took a cab out to a cousin whom I had never met before and stayed at his house for one night. Cost me $20 cab fare, so I'm down to $160. But anyway, to move on to the story of what happened subsequently, I met a girl that was Japanese. Her name was Amy, and we worked at the same department store called Liberty House. And later she moved to the retail side of Liberty House, and I took a job at Sears in Ala Moana Center. Well, we obviously got along well and started dating and so forth. And seriously, I know I reflect on this from time to time, but she told me that she thought she was pregnant. And we were both 19 years old, and her father was in sales in the insurance business, and it would have been bad for business, and he wanted her to get an abortion. And I didn't think that was the right thing to do. So what happened was my mother, Marge, flew out from Illinois and helped me navigate the delicate condition that required, in a way, negotiation with Amy's parents that allowed us to get married.
What do you think at that time was in your heart that knew you wanted to have the child? Because it would have been a lot easier to just go along with them.
I can't tell you. I only can say in retrospect that it was providential and predestined that Todd be born, because now in retrospect, Todd is 61 years old and a parent himself. He's got 3 children. I have another son, Chris, who just turned 60. And when you think about it, Todd and Chris and the grandchildren wouldn't be around had I taken the easy way out and gone along with Amy's parents. So this is a story for the Kimura clan that can trace back to a decision made in 1961-62 that's affected a whole lot of people 60 plus years later, much less in the future generations of Kimuras that wouldn't be around had Ron Kimura made a different decision, or perhaps it wasn't providentially called for that to transpire.
And do you remember Todd's birth that day?
Yeah. Well, what happened was that from a cultural standpoint, perhaps I'm only speculating as to what Amy's parents wanted to avoid was the embarrassment of their daughter giving birth at her age, her circumstances, and so forth. So Todd was born in Chicago, so we had left town during his birth. Subsequently, we moved out of Chicago and moved to California. So that's a whole nother story. But the feeling at the time, in retrospect, was that was a way of satisfying Amy's parents and avoiding the embarrassment from their perspective and perhaps the shame of what had transpired with their daughter. What's interesting is that Todd, fast forward in, would have been in 95, I believe, graduated from dental school at UOP in San Francisco. And as a part of that celebration, Amy's father, Shinsky Nakamine, was there at the graduation. It had been a number of years since I had seen him, and somehow his memory of those early year circumstances when he had first met me wasn't even talked about. But I always did have a curiosity of what his thinking was, and whether he had any curiosity as to what would have happened had I listened to him. But I never did have that opportunity to talk with him about that.
So tell me, Ron, about after Todd is born and then Chris is born a year later.
18 months later.
18 months later.
18 months later.
And how long after that is you guys get a divorce?
Well, Amy and I moved to Inglewood, California. And Chris was born in Los Angeles, and Amy and I were together living on Crenshaw Boulevard, 9400 Crenshaw Boulevard, until probably we were married overall about 6 years. So I must have been around 26, 27 years old, when basically it was an amicable divorce. We just kind of grew up. And Amy subsequently had the boys living with her. And this isn't your question, but the answer was I was probably around 26, 27 years old. And subsequently, Amy wanted to remarry. And so the person she was going to marry, named Marshall, had already had adult kids and didn't want to have responsibilities of being a stepfather. So Amy asked me if I would take the boys, which I was more than happy to. I was And so the boys came to live with me when they were around, I'd say around 11 years old, 11, 12 years old, somewhere around there. And we were living in Playa del Rey, and in close to Los Angeles. And so I coached Little League Baseball with them, and subsequently we moved down to San Diego. But what was your question again?
Were they already surfing before Playa del Rey, or when did they get into surfing?
Yeah, I have interesting memories of the house we lived on Waterview, 138 Waterview in Playa del Rey. They had built a skateboard ramp. And so it was a downhill driveway, and they built a ramp on the back end. And it was really creative on their part. I just have interesting memories. I don't know that they got into surfing then. Maybe they did. I can't really remember. I'll have to ask them when they got into surfing. But they really got into surfing when we moved down to Leucadia in San Diego in 1979, 1978, 79.
And so were you already in real estate at that point?
Not quite. Well, actually, when we moved down to San Diego, I was in real estate. I got into real estate. I ended up floating around in different jobs, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do. One of my earliest jobs out of college was with National Cash Register, and I went to work for them in 1966, 65, and I was making $80 a week gross, driving from Inglewood out to Arcadia, taking cash registers, going business to business, trying to sell cash registers. And that wasn't the career that I had in mind, but I didn't know what I was good at. So I ended up going to UCLA and taking 24 hours of testing and counseling. And they determined that psychologically I was, and maybe this is providential, should be in real estate development.
Wow.
And so they also further in the counseling aspect of these tests determined that I should either inherit a lot of money or go into business for myself. Obviously, it was too late to inherit a lot of money, but going into business for myself. Why? Because the kind of personality I had. I make decisions on the basis of what I consider to be priority. I hate being told what to do. And so a guy named Jack Kane with John R. Kane and Company hired me to do construction management and leasing of a medical office building in Inglewood, California. So I went to work for him for 5 years, and then I went into business for myself.
And how did you get that job?
In the leasing, in the development and leasing of the medical office building at Daniel Freeman Hospital in Inglewood, there was a Sister Mary Esther that was the administrator of the hospital. And there was another woman, Sister Marie Chapla, that was her second in command. Sister Marie transferred to become the president of St. Mary's Hospital in Tucson, Arizona. So I had developed a relationship with Sister Marie, and so I flew to Tucson and met with Sister Marie and talked to her about developing a medical office building on the campus of St. Mary's Hospital. So we signed a tri-party agreement between ourselves. I had a fellow by the name of Charlie Supple, who was my first business partner. We had formed a company called Manhattan Development Group. And Manhattan Development Group entered into an agreement with St. Mary's Hospital and a potential lender to finance this medical office building. And so neither Charlie nor I had any money, but we had an accountant that had a client by the name of Carl Pinamonti. Carl was a general contractor and he had a substantial net worth. So we partnered with Carl. We got 50% of the deal and Carl got 50% of the deal, plus he got to do the construction of the medical office building. So we developed a 42,000 square foot medical office building on the campus of St. Mary's Hospital in Tucson, Arizona.
Wow.
And it's all because of the relationship that I had developed over the succeeding years with Sister Marie Chaplin that allowed us to develop the trust and so forth, that Sister Marie was willing to take a flyer on a couple of young guys that had no previous development background except for working for Jack Kane for that 5 years prior. So subsequent to that, I spent a lot of time in Tucson, Arizona, and also that's when I really got into development on my own after 5 years of apprentice work, shall we say, with Jack Kane. So subsequent to that, it was project after project. I ended up doing medical office buildings in Cedars-Sinai, in Brentwood, in different parts of California.
What was your favorite part of those projects? Was it the development, that when you would see the final product, or?
Yeah, the amazing thing about real estate development is to envision, have a idea of what you want to develop. For example, the first project I ever was involved with when I was working for Jack Kane is the medical building on the campus of Daniel Freeman Hospital, where there was a parking lot and we had plans drawn of this medical building that went up before my very eyes. And each stage, whether it's the foundation, whether it's the steel, whether it's the masonry part of the job, and then ultimately drinking champagne and eating shrimp in the pharmacy was just like a dream come true. So the aspect of real estate is so fascinating because there's an artistic component to it, but there's also the people side of it, because the doctors that we would put into the building are all in existing medical office buildings someplace else. So it was really interesting that I would walk into a doctor's office trying to get them to lease space in our new building with only a picture. And I'd say to the receptionist, I'm here to talk to the doctor about this building. She would take the picture back to the doctor, who was in the midst of seeing patients. I'm sitting there with a room full of patients waiting to see the doctor, and I'm thinking, wow, I don't know if I'm going to see this. In 2 minutes, the nurse would be bringing me back to see the doctor, and these other people that are sitting in the waiting room for their own ailments are going, what is this guy doing? It always astounded me how I could get in to see a doctor by just showing him a picture.
So you're in Leucadia, you have your boys now, and they're surfing and you're doing real estate, and at some point you moved to Hawaii again?
No, no, no. What happened was the boys took up. I don't know when they took up surfing actually, but our place in Sea Bluff was like a revolving door. It was what was so amazing is they'd have all of their friends because the surf spot right below our home was right down the steps. So before surfing and after surfing, they'd rotate through our refrigerator door. it was it was so amazing. But yeah, I have all kinds of memories, and so I would be traveling back and forth because I had partnered with another group of individuals, and we were developing apartments in Texas. So I would fly between San Diego and Texas, doing development in Texas. The boys would kind of be on their own, which that's a whole other story where they would get into mischief that I didn't know about until later on in life when they were adults, and they'd say, "Hey Dad, remember when such and such?" And I'm just amazed what, as a single parent, I didn't know what was going on. So, but no, subsequently, Todd ended up going out on his own, getting into dentistry, getting married, and then he subsequently has moved to
Okay.
Hawaii.
Got it. So now you're living your dreams. You're developing these homes and apartment buildings and medical buildings, and you're skiing down Double Diamond, Black Diamond mountains. You're doing triathlons. You're swimming, and you're racing your Porsche around. Tell me about that part of your life.
You know, in retrospect, there's a lot of things in those years that are shameful for me from the perspective of where my values were at the time. And it really relates to faith in a way. But one of my business partners was a guy named Scott Linton. And Scott and I met when I was in another business relationship where we had offices at Town Center Drive in La Jolla. And Scott was just going out on his own, having left Marcus and Millichap. Scott has a law background, went to law school at USD, never practiced law, but was in real estate development, or was in real estate quite successfully. And he was looking for office space, so we had a couple of offices to sublet. So that's where Scott and I met. Well, Scott was a strong Christian, and he had invited me to go to a Bible study. And this is during a time in my life, as you mentioned, I was skiing, snowcat skiing, doing jumps off the Cornice at Mammoth, going to Steamboat Springs, going to Jackson Hole, going to Taos, going to North Star, going to Heavenly, just skiing all around.
How did you feel at that point in your life? Like your confidence of just what you made of yourself? How old were you? In your 30s?
I was in my, the range of time was probably between 35 and 45, probably was the age. So this was like 40 years ago or longer, when I was into speed, the need for speed, and I thought I had life under control. But I said to Scott when he asked me if I wanted to go to this Bible study, "No, Scott, I think I'm okay." And so I'm training, I'm doing triathlons, I'm doing all of this stuff, and one of the things that we used to do was to swim out in the ocean, which is different than pool swimming. It's totally different. You know, in the pool swimming, you're following a line, and it's, you know, it's no big deal. In the ocean, it's a whole another kettle of fish, as they say. Well, this one Friday morning, we would swim every Friday morning all through the winter out in front of what is now PCG. It used to be Charlie's restaurant in Cardiff, and we would go south to the second lifeguard tower and then back, and then we'd go to VG Donuts. Well, this one Friday morning, we were socked in at 6 o'clock in the morning. You couldn't see 10 feet. So we made the decision we'd go in anyway and kind of stick together and so forth. So as soon as we got in, we separated. And I'm swimming away, and I stopped at some point in time, and I'm looking around, and I made the mistake of rotating, keeping in mind that there's fog that has a ceiling. I felt like I was in a closet. And I'm looking at the water, at the currents, to see which way the currents were going. I had no way of knowing whether I was swimming north, south, east, or west. So if I started swimming and I'm going in the wrong direction, I could be swimming to Hawaii. So at that point, I had an out-of-body experience, because I raised my arm because I was hallucinating, like I was looking down. I could see myself. I could see my gloved hand, and I realized I don't have the control I think I do. It was one of those realizations that you think you got your stuff together, and you really don't. And it was a humbling experience, and I said, okay, I'll go to that Bible study. So I started swimming, not knowing again which direction I was going, but I heard the train go by, because the coaster goes by on some regularity, and I knew which way was east. So I swam in, and as soon as my feet hit the ground, I said, well, maybe I don't have to go to that Bible study. But I ended up going, and it totally changed my life. The men I met there, the aspect of finding faith, of relying on a North Star in the persons of Jesus, and developing over time. It didn't happen overnight, but over the period of years subsequent, I developed, and I'm still continuing to develop, a faith and a mantra that says, He is with me. That is a screensaver I have on my computer now that is embedded in my psyche, that gives great peace and comfort in life's discomfort, in life's suffering. And it allows me to embrace failure, embraces uncertainty, embraces fear, to where I can't even imagine not having that kind of faith.
You're a very curious person. Was that something that you always were, or it's been developed over time? Tell us a little bit about how that affects your life.
Well, I think as I was saying in the beginning about being childlike as opposed to childish, curiosity is both childlike and childish. But curiosity, I believe I've always had curiosity. I think that is one of my defaults that motivates me to talk to strangers. What's interesting is that a few years ago, Todd invited me to a conference in Walnut Creek, and he met me at the Oakland airport. I flew up from San Diego and he flew from someplace else, and we met at Oakland. And he was going to go rent a car. And so we went down to the Hertz Rent-A-Car place, and he said, "Dad, why don't you go sit there? I'll take care of the car." So I'm sitting there like a geezer, even though I wasn't that old at the time. And I observed Todd in line at the Hertz Rent-A-Car place. And what was so amazing is I see him talking to the people in line, the strangers, and so forth. Chris has the same characteristic. Where do they get that from? It was just, it's just innate, I think. Where I got it from, God only knows. But I just am always fascinated by people's stories, and so that's why I'm doing what you're doing now, is talking to people and finding out what their stories are, because there's a timelessness to people's story, a common thread that we all have as human beings that goes from generation to generations. The parables in life, the heroes that we look for, the heroes that we emulate, the joys and sorrows of life are just so common in a way, and yet unique to each individual. And so there's coincidences that are so fascinating to me, where people that know people, for example, we've talked with different people, like you and I, Mario, have known each other for a couple of years. You're talking to a friend of yours through his son, Jeff Bell. I've just met Jeff Bell. I'm reading his posts, and I read stories about Pat Davis. I know Pat Davis. Pat Davis knows Terry Kaltenbach. Pat Davis knows Brian Driscoll. I know Brian Driscoll. Up until meeting Jeff Bell, meeting you, I wouldn't have known that we have so many people in common. Pasquale Russo, David Russo. You know David Russo. I know David Russo. We came from different places. It is just, there's a connection of all of us who walk this planet that are interconnected. Your business partner, Marcos. I knew Marcos from another time in his life. I believe that as human beings, there's and I've talked about it before, in physics it's called quantum entanglement. It's where there's this connection from a physics standpoint. I happen to believe that there's a connection on a human standpoint, that when we hear each other's stories, there's brain chemistry that occurs. Well, quantum entanglement is a term that's used in physics, but I use it as kind of a metaphoric way of describing what I consider to be our human entanglement. The universal need to be understood, to be accepted, to be heard, is a form of entanglement that is related to storytelling. I love the thought of talking to people and finding out their story. So quantum entanglement to me relates to finding a common thread, a common reason why we get emotionally connected to others. How almost intuitively one can sense authenticity, genuineness, transactional versus relationships, where people are trying to sell you something. There's a different aura that I believe people can sense, as opposed to a relational relationship that comes from genuineness, from authenticity, from demonstrating who you are from a real person's standpoint. And that's the entanglement that I'm using in the term quantum entanglement.
And you were briefly talking about the connections and the coincidences, and some would call it the synchronicity. I think that's a Carl Jung term, and there's definitely there's faith too to it, that this isn't coincidence, that things happen for a reason, and you have brought up a certain level of like predestination plays into it, that we're on this path. And how do you think faith is intertwined into all these connections that are constantly being made, and the coincidences and the friendships and this whole wild life that you've lived? And I don't think the audience knows, but how old are you, Ron?
81.
81. So 81 years of experiencing this life. And to backtrack just a little bit, when did you start experiencing or feeling those coincidences, and that something bigger was at play?
Well, I believe there's a couple of, what would you call them, touchstones that I became aware of. One is when I was going through a period of loss and grief in the 90s. And I decided for some reason to become a volunteer at San Diego Hospice. And I've told you the story that how does a person say, hey, I want to hang out with people that are going through the death and dying process? There's no way I can intellectualize and say, gee, it was this, or that. One day I thought, I want to go volunteer someplace and get involved in something that's meaningful and has purpose. And so I went down to San Diego Hospice and was going through 30 plus hours of training and so forth. And the person sitting next to me on the first indoctrination class was Lola, Lola Jordan, who now we've been married for 30 plus years. But it didn't begin that way. And the more that I reflected back on situations like that occurred, I started making notes. Every time there was a coincidence or a providential predestination, God thing, whatever you want to call it. And I realized also that, as they say, the direction of the wind, metaphorically, coming at your face doesn't mean that your boat's going to necessarily go backwards depending on the set of the sails. So metaphorically, it's our attitude that changes the direction of the wind. So we all have a choice as to what we choose to have faith in, what we believe in, how we want to live our lives. And again, it's the set of the sails, it's the attitude. So do I believe that there is such a thing as predestination, things that are providential? If I believe that, what's so amazing is how it actually ends up manifesting itself to be true. Now, whether it's just some woo-woo science, I have no idea. But given the choice, I'd rather act as if it is. And at some point in time, we'll find out whether I've been misleading myself all these years or whether there's something to it. But in the meantime, I'm utilizing it. And that's why talking with people about their life story and other stories helps me to connect the dots with others that have experienced the same sort of experience.
And you mentioned that you would keep a journal entry of some of these occurrences. Do you still do that?
Yes. Yeah, it's, in fact, as you know, I do a gratitude post and I do interviews with people utilizing the phrase that you introduced me to. Blessed are those that plant seeds for trees under whose shade they'll never sit. That's a idea that comes to mind as I've gotten older, because no matter how many years I live, there's going to be generations beyond that are going to experiences that I've gone through that perhaps can be helpful. So to be able to interact with younger people is something that really is helpful for me in keeping track of some of these coincidences, because they just keep on coming. And so to journal them is something that you can always look back on, and other generations will look back on and read these things and realize, gee, that can be helpful in finding the real joy and delight in living life. And the ultimate question is, how will you measure your life? What is that based on? Is it based on material things? Is it based on the car you drive, the watch you wear, the house you live in? Or is it something a little more ethereal, like relationships, like people that you've been impacted by, the people that impact you? For planting seeds for trees under whose shade you'll never sit. To me, that is living for a purpose that's greater than oneself, which is You know, if you're a student of Joseph Campbell and the journey of the hero, going through the life cycle of joys and sorrows, and how we are all standing on the shoulders of those that have come before us. So to participate in that whole process is somehow gratifying.
Talk a little more about the gratitude journaling that you've been doing now. How long have you been doing that, and how did that get started, and how does that help you?
Well, I think there's a science behind gratitude, feeling grateful, feeling thankful. Again, it relates to the set of the sails. It's perhaps natural to feel cynical, negative. It has to do with expectations. And feeling gratitude is something that, and doing a gratitude journal I've been doing for a couple of years. It's only been the last, I don't know, year that I've been posting gratitude, my gratitudes, and it allows me to be part of a widening circle, shall we say, of brain science that comes from things such as oxytocin, such as dopamine, serotonin. So gratitude and thankfulness is one segment of other adventures, if you can call it that, of experiencing discomfort, such as cold water immersion, which I've talked about. Sitting in a tub of cold water that's 48 degrees or 47 degrees or 45 degrees for 4 minutes. Then the euphoria, the chemicals that are created in one's body is a part of kind of a holistic approach that I've been exploring. So, but to answer your question, the journaling aspect is evolving. So thanks to you, I've learned CapCut and can add music and audio too, and I want to continue my YouTube interviews with people. I have a list of people that I'm looking to talk with and will be talking to, and hopefully, as long as the internet's around, people that are interested and equally curious, which is really the whole evolution that we're in right now, I believe, is content creation and artificial intelligence and all of the things that surround technology. When electricity was first invented, there was no such thing as a light switch. You would turn the electricity on by unscrewing the bulb. But somebody came up with the idea, gee, is there a better way of doing it? So they created light switches, and then there's rheostats where you can dim the lights. Well, artificial intelligence, in my mind, is a tool that there will be all kinds of exciting things that will happen in the years ahead, whether it be strictly for data collection and summary and so forth, but I'm just so excited about all the technology that's out there now with cameras and artificial intelligence and all of the opportunities to skate to where the puck's gonna be. Can you imagine when automobiles were first invented? There were people that would say, oh, horses will never go out of style. Well, Of course, horses are maybe back in style now to a certain degree, but anyway, I'm rambling, but that's how long I've been doing gratitude.
You started to talk about Lola. Can you talk a little more about your 30-year marriage and what you've learned from her as because she's a psychologist
She's a
or family
marriage and
therapist.
family therapist.
Yeah.
Well, after our initial meeting at San Diego Hospice, I was single, and I would say that I was not ready to settle down. And so we lived together. We were living together for 5 years. And I thought, well, I think Lola wants to get married, but I'm not ready to get married. So at a certain point in time, I said to her, gee, I don't know that I'm ever going to be interested in making a commitment to marriage. And so we decided we would go our separate ways. So I rented a place in Sun Valley, Idaho. We were living in Cardiff at the time. And to give her space to find her own place and so forth. But I had an interesting providential experience in Sun Valley. I was there in March, and at the Warm Springs Lodge, I was talking to a guy that had just come from Jackson Hole. He was landing in Sun Valley, and he was meeting a woman. He had just left a woman in Jackson Hole and was meeting someone in Sun Valley. And then he was going to go to Steamboat Springs and meet somebody else at Steamboat Springs. And I thought, wow, this guy's 10 years older than me. And is this the kind of a guy I want to be in 10 years? And my short answer was no, I don't want to be that person. So I called Lola up from the lodge, and I said, I don't know when I want to get married, but I'm open to talking about it. So we got back together, and a year later, we ended up getting married. So that's the part of the story that was influential from Lola's standpoint. The second part about her is that she was an executive recruiter for years as a professional, but she's always had a calling for doing psychotherapy. We've both been through therapy, and it's a profession that has its own amazing aspects to, well, it seemed appropriate. So Lola decided to go to Fuller Theological Seminary for her degree and her master's, and eventually became a psychotherapist and has her own office now that she's had for decades. But it's one of those things that we have the opportunity to talk about self-awareness and self-esteem and the importance of self-awareness and being willing to confront the paradoxes of life in a way that balances the reality with the hope that everything's going to be all right. And those are things that there's a collaboration, I feel, that between Lola and me that's been helpful for both of us. So I would just underscore the aspect of her encouragement of confronting the aspects of our personalities, and specifically my personality that's still dealing with and which is one of the things I wrote about in my gratitude posts, is being willing and able to look at the side of my personality that I dislike, the pettiness, the impatience, the judgmental side, the annoyance side, and to allow it to coexist with the grace and mercy side and the loving side of my personality, and to allow it to coexist and yet be aware of it so that I can prune and cull away the sides that hamper my own growth. So I would say that it's Lola in my relationship has the atmosphere of open-mindedness and conversation and dealing with the issues of life in a straightforward manner, as straightforward as you can be given one's personality differences.
That's beautiful. What do you think you'd want to leave with young people? I don't know if I'm considered young anymore, but what's some advice that you'd want to leave with people, as if legacy is another word that we've kind of talked about without talking about it, but something you feel that young people should understand or grasp about life that an older generation has and we've kind of maybe lost or need?
I think there's probably a couple things, but I would preface my response by saying, I don't know if it's possible for a person coming from my side of the timeline to really be anything more than an example. And there's really nothing I could say, because for the most part, we don't know what we don't know. But even if I was to go back to that 20-year-old person that I talked about getting off the plane in Hawaii with $180 in my pocket and said, okay, here's what's going to happen. Here's what you can do differently. I don't know that I would have even listened to it. But reading a book about Jean Valjean and Les Miserables, and asking questions such as, who am I? So maybe asking a question, who are you? Who am I? Would be one question. How will I measure my life? Is another question. So rather than to say, this is how you should do it, or you might consider this, or any roundabout way of teaching, influencing, whatever, is to just ask the question. Who am I? How will I measure my life? To your question, what's the legacy you'd want to leave? We're all writing our life story. We're just in different chapters. So I'm not quite yet to write the prologue, but the chapters that are remaining to be written are few. But the question will be, how does that story end? And the entire book, in a holistic sense, would be something that younger people can read about in other books I think of all the things that I think have been helpful in my own life is reading, and the ability that it's so amazing that letters of the alphabet can create words. Words can create sentences. Sentences can create paragraphs. Paragraphs communicate concepts. And those concepts lead us in a direction that can influence and motivate and inspire and give guidelines to and direct a trend of how one lives their life. And so by reading, the people that you feel an emotional connection to, a positivity about, is something that utilizing the childlike qualities of creativity, of open-mindedness, of resilience, getting up, powering on, taking one step at a time, the 1% improvement on a daily basis, all little mantras along the way comes from reading, comes from being exposed to new ideas, uncomfortable ideas, being willing to take discomfort as a challenge, to be consistent. It is so hard to do what you say you're going to do, speak the truth in love. All of these things are so fundamental and yet so hard to do. It's a rare person that can be consistent throughout their life, but how does one want to live their life? What I found in the hospice example, which we've talked about before, is to see how people live their life is how they die. The same way that they die is the same way that they've lived. So it's all our individual responsibility. No matter what the circumstances are, we're holding the tools, we have the capabilities within our hands.
Thank you, Ron, for sharing today. And I look forward to talking with you more, and I'm thankful for our friendship.
Thank you, Mario, for your excellent questions. I look forward to having those seeds for trees planted under whose shade I'll never sit. So thank you for that too.
Thanks, Ron.